Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Pediatric Brain Tumor Foundation's virtual town hall, Finding Meaning in Times of Uncertainty. My name is Kathy Riley. I'm Vice President of Family Support for the Pediatric Brain Tumor Foundation, and we are so honored to have you joining us today for this important town hall. We'll be hearing from Dr. Shannon Cava from the Cancer Support Community in Los Angeles, and then we'll have two parents joining us for a Q&A. Before I introduce our speaker, I have a few housekeeping items I'd like to review with you. You may keep your video cameras turned on so that we can all see the larger pediatric brain tumor community here to support you. You're muted for this town hall, but we welcome your questions during and after the presentation. Please type your questions into the chat box found at the bottom of the Zoom window. And feel free to ask questions of Dr. Cava, but also questions you might want to ask of another parent. We won't get to every question today, but we'll try to get to as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. Shannon Cava is a clinical psychologist specializing in psychosocial oncology and is the Chief Clinical Officer and Director of Programs and Research at the Cancer Support Community, Los Angeles. Dr. Cava's research interests are in multidisciplinary engagement to support the psychosocial needs of pediatric young adult and adult patients and caregivers. She completed her training on meaning-centered psychotherapy from William Breitbart, MD, and his team at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. She facilitates the meaning-centered psychotherapy groups at the Cancer Support Community, Los Angeles. I am so happy to welcome Dr. Shannon Cava. Shannon?
Thank you so much. And I want to thank Kathy Riley and Heather Held from the Pediatric Brain Tumor Foundation for inviting me to do this talk. I'm pleased to be here, as well as let you know I do not have any financial disclosures, so we can just jump right into it and head on to the next slide. So this is a very rough outline of the talk today. I didn't want to put too much of a table of contents. It's going to be rather simple. And really the idea is that we're just going to identify our values and our joy, happiness, ultimately discussing purpose and a deeper meaning. Advance. So this is kind of a long list, probably hard to read depending on what screen you're on, but just to kind of take a look. These are different areas of one's life that might be meaningful and might show value. So take a look and see what resonates with you as a parent, as a provider, as a person living in this world. What is meaningful in terms of relationships, in terms of goals, and what you aspire to do with career, with family. So really, it's what do you value? And this could be coming to the idea of joy, coming to the idea of growth, family, health. I typically do a much longer little intervention with this and have people pick 15 and then scale it down and scale it down and scale it down until you get to 1. Feedback is that's very hard, but sometimes just getting to that 1 is a little bit easier. And this is fluid. There's no connection to whatever you identify today as meaningful as what you might identify tomorrow or what you identified yesterday. It's just a way to see what you can find meaningful and valuable in your life. So you can keep this in mind as we go through this talk today. Kathy, you can advance. Okay. So this is an idea of Ikigai that I'd love to share with you, especially as we start off this talk. Ikigai literally means reason to live, and this comes from the Japanese word Ikigai. It's how you find pleasure and meaning and joy in life. And it doesn't mean anything grand or anything small. It can be anything, a continuum. And Ken Mogi wrote, Awakening Your Ikigai, how the Japanese wake up to joy and purpose every day. And in this book, he has a small story about Hiro Ono, who was a sushi chef, Michelin star rated sushi chef. He's had a documentary made about him, and his sushi restaurant is in, I think, the train station or in the subway in Japan. And when President Obama was in the administration, he visited Hiro. And so that moment of having a president come and visit and just kind of give such the highest esteem was absolutely a place for that Ikigai, for that reason, right? But there's also the smaller realms of what brings joy. So think about what brings you joy, and it might be being outside and having the sun warm your skin. It could be that sip of coffee or hot tea. It could be just taking a moment to take a deep breath, or any practice in between. So it doesn't have to be a great deed or a huge aspirational goal. It can be these small elements that we can identify in our daily life that really does kind of bring pleasure and bring joy. So this is just an idea to remember of that smaller, more attainable vision of joy. And you can advance. So Thich Nhat Hanh actually wrote The Art of Communication, and Thich Nhat Hanh is a mindfulness and meditation healer. He was born in Vietnam, and he actually utilized his skills during the Vietnam War to bring people some relief to their suffering during the wartime. And he has traveled worldwide and spoken about mindfulness, and he practices in France now. And in his book, The Art of Communication, he really brings the idea that when we understand suffering, we can understand happiness. So if we know how to handle suffering, we will know how to handle happiness and produce happiness. So looking at it from also that continuum, that you can't have one without the other, almost like a yin and yang, right? So I would like to read another little passage from The Art of Communicating. And if you want to advance the slide, Kathy, you can follow along. I didn't put it in its entirety. So on the next slide, you'll see, if a lotus is to grow, it needs to be rooted in the mud. Compassion is born from understanding suffering. We all should learn to embrace our own suffering, to listen to it deeply, and to have a deep look into its nature. In doing so, we allow the energy of love and compassion to be born. When the energy of compassion is born, right away we suffer less. When we suffer less, when we have compassion for ourselves, we can more easily understand the suffering of another person and of the world. Then our communication with others will be based on the desire to understand rather than the desire to prove ourselves right or make ourselves feel better. So this just kind of is another illustration, is that suffering and pain might be in our lives, but how can we also see the meaning and the joy and the happiness combined? And when I say happiness, it does not mean that you can't have other emotions. They're all welcome. We're not striving to be only happy. Feeling all of our emotions is important too. But this is just a perspective of more of a mindfulness component. And you can go on to the next slide. Okay. So this one might be a little tough to read, and it's hard because I can't see my audience, but to give an illustration, I just wanted to put this triangle that's on the right, unless my screen is flipped on for you, but the idea of the hierarchy of needs. So this triangle represents from Abraham Maslow's work of we need to have those physiological needs met, and then safety and security. We need housing. Then we can move into those psychological needs of belonging and our self-esteem, with the ultimate goal getting to that moment of self-actualization and fulfillment. It's really what's the meaning piece of this triangle. Fun fact, I guess, Abraham Maslow actually did not ever put this in a hierarchical or a triangle. This came later, but his work really illustrated each of these points. And what I wanted to share with you is I actually just attended in much the same video conference, a talk with Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman, and he recently released a book, Transcendent. It's Transcend, the New Science of Self-Actualization. And he took this idea from Abraham Maslow and he moved it into the idea of a sailboat. So if you see that security is at the bottom, so that's our safety, our connection, and our self-esteem. These are more of those basic needs, but the sail is where we first see that exploration. So the foundation of exploration and how we open ourselves up can bring ourselves love and can bring ourselves purpose. And the idea here is that it's fluid, and the idea that it's on water, I think, is even more illustrative of that point where we can move throughout these different elements of growth. So if we go to the next slide, I believe I have a quote that I can share with you, and it's just a little bit more of an understanding of this idea of transcendence. So from the very beginning, and even with Abraham Maslow, self-actualization was the idea of like fully human. And in my work, in our work here at the Cancer Support Community, it's often talking about the whole person. So if you, especially if you have a child that is receiving medical care, that treatment can be so necessary for the life of this child. But what else is there to make that child a whole person, to make your family whole, to make you feel whole? So it is kind of that idea of not just that safety, the security, the physiological and biological need, but those other areas. So in treating the whole person, that's where we can look at the social and emotional component of care for a person and a family. And in the work here by Dr. Kaufman, it's the idea that with favorable conditions, we're going to have a greater force towards those areas of exploration, love, and purpose. But with unfavorable conditions, when we have harder times or distress, we might be focused more on that bottom security level, right? It's going to be a little bit harder to grow. But the idea is that we have that fluidity and we can move into those different areas. And ultimately, growth can build on the fundamental need for exploration to reach those higher levels of integration within oneself and to contribute something meaningful to the world. So in the idea of maybe opening your sail, sometimes that idea of exploration, love, and purpose, it's to be a little bit more open, a little bit more vulnerable than possibly when we're really in the midst of more trauma, where we might close up and tighten our clenches on our family and taking care of ourselves first and foremost. So the idea of kind of being more open, that's where that exploration can help and lead to these different areas of growth and purpose. You can advance. So I'd love to introduce the idea of living with meaning, and I'll talk a little bit more as we go into this about meaning-centered psychotherapy. But to kind of, I have the idea of the base for that work. Frederick Nietzsche said, "He who has a why to live can bear with almost any how." And just so that sinks in, I want to say it one more time. So he who has a why to live, that purpose, can bear with almost any how. And in the meaning-centered psychotherapy work, the idea is that finding a sense of purpose and meaning can help alleviate the distress in one's life. So finding your why. You can advance. Okay. So Viktor Frankl, he wrote The Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist who was at Auschwitz, actually, and lost his family. And through that, he still remained with a sense of hope. And he, through that, started thinking of all these ideas, and then when he was released, he did write Man's Search for Meaning to really show the idea of pain versus suffering and where hope can still be an element even in those worst, like most dire situations. So with regards to cancer, he wrote, "We must never forget that we may find meaning in life even when confronted with a hopeless situation, when facing a fate that cannot be changed. For what then matters is to bear witness to the uniquely human potential at its best, which is to transform tragedy into triumph, to turn a predicament into achievement." So when we are no longer able to change the situation, such as inoperable cancer, we are challenged to change ourselves. We can go to the next slide. So the title of the talk was a bit about uncertainty, and we all know right now we are experiencing another form of isolation, right? And we have civil unrest and social justice discussions, and we have a lot of change happening right now. But this, I think, can still apply because these are things that are out of our control. How can we really change our frame and lens on what that means to us and find meaning? You can go ahead. Okay. This, I think, is just a reiteration of what I just said. So when we can't change the situation, right, we might be stuck at home. There might be large families inside a house, no school, right? So what does that mean for us? And that's where we kind of challenge our thinking. Go ahead. So this is a quick outline of the work in meaning-centered psychotherapy. So this is what we do sometimes in our groups, and there is individual work with meaning-centered psychotherapy. be. And the idea is that there's 4 sources of meaning, and that's historical, attitudinal, creative, and experiential. And on the next slides, I'll go into a little depth for each of these, so you can continue. So historical sources. So this is living a legacy. And this is what you've received as a legacy from your past. What were your mentors like? Who were your parents? What was your life like? That all plays a part in who you are today. And then who do you want to be into the future? That's the life that you live, the legacy that you live. And the decisions that you make can kind of fill that. And then the future is the legacy that you will give. And I really, this stood out to me in this work, that they use a very active sense here. They say giving a legacy, the legacy that you will give, rather than leaving a legacy, because that is a bit more passive. And this, I think, gives control in the way that you think about how you will be able to give legacy. So that's the idea of those areas, past, present, and future, informing who you are and the legacy. You can go to the next slide. In terms of attitudinal sources, this is that tragedy to triumph. So this is really about perspective taking, right? Long ago, I heard the idea of pain versus suffering. So pain does not necessarily need to cause suffering. Suffering is how we really internalize and interpret the pain. So if we can flip that a little bit, and it's more about the reactions that we have, we can maybe alleviate some of our suffering. We might not be able to alleviate the pain through this method, but we can reduce its impact on ourselves and our daily life. So that's the tragedy to triumph also, that it's something that can be very tragic in one's life or in one's family, maybe looking at other opportunities through that, or how you can build relations through that, or how you can strengthen other areas of your life in that tragedy. You can continue. Creative sources of meaning, and this is just how you engage in life. So are you working? Are you a student? Are you a mentor? Are you a volunteer? What are your accomplishments? What's important to you in your role? Are you a parent, a mother, father? Are you a sister or a brother? What's important in those areas, and how do you engage? The courage and commitment and responsibility. So this is kind of, how do we kind of challenge ourselves? In addition to creative sources, it can even just be how we use life as an outlet. Are we artistic? Are we creative? There's many different ways to look at our life in a creative way. And then the final slide for this, if we go on, is experiential. And this is our relationships. This is our taking a walk by the beach and hearing the sound of the ocean and having that be of an inspiration to us. So this is really how we engage and interact with our surroundings and with our environment and the people within it. So that can also be a source of meaning for us. Go ahead to the next slide. Okay. So really at the end of this talk, and I know this was a very brief introduction to the idea of meaning. Meaning does seem pretty heavy and powerful and large, and we did it in 20 minutes. But if you can take this as a jumping off point to really identify what is meaningful to you, that's the whole goal here. And I think this just gives you a little bit of an idea of what work is out there that you can maybe sample or read or experience, or maybe go to a yoga class or a mindfulness class and see kind of how you can tap into that idea too of what's meaningful to you. And if you go to the next slide, I know we won't get time for this, but I did want to include this slide so you can see other areas. Maybe you can get a little bit of relief or add a little bit of, a moment to center yourself. So if you get an opportunity, diaphragmatic breathing, very quickly I'll show you. If I've originally always held my hand on my chest and one on my belly, and as you breathe out, you want to feel your belly moving. So it's kind of a belly breathing. Taking a deep breath and a long exhale can help center yourself. It can do things physiologically in your body. It can also reduce stress, but it also gives you a moment to slow down. Not long ago, I saw actually somebody, if you give yourself a hug, you kind of center that whole rib cage. So when you breathe in deeply, when you're giving yourself a hug, you're automatically kind of pulling from that diaphragm. 4-7-8 breathing, if you get a moment to look that up, that's just another tool where you inhale for 4 counts, you hold it for 7 counts, and you breathe out for 8 counts. And they even have apps for this, I believe. So if you just want something to help you kind of get centered in into the moment, that can be useful. And there's a lot of guided imagery out there. We can't do that today, but I know even out here, UCLA has the MARC, which is the Mindfulness Institute there at UCLA, where they have free MP3s available on their website of different imagery and meditation. So you can look at for many things in the community. And if you go to the next slide, I think we are coming close to the end. So in closing, and this is from Viktor Frankl again, but if there is meaning, it is unconditional meaning, and neither suffering nor dying can detract from it. So I thank you all very much for the opportunity. I'm excited to be here with your panel. That last slide, and I think these can be shared or on the video, are all of the books that I pulled from to share this with you if you have interest in learning more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Cava. We're so grateful for that presentation and the information that you shared. So we can take 1 or 2 questions for Dr. Cava, and then we'll welcome our parents. So any questions that you have, please go ahead and type into the chat box. We have a couple of questions already. So if you'll pardon my look away from the screen, Dr. Cava, I do have a question or 2 for you. So going back to the Viktor Frankl quote about bearing witness, how have you seen people find meaning in suffering?
That's such a good question. I can give some small examples and then also kind of a broader idea of what that means. With the work that we've done in terms of families coming together in suffering and finding meaning, we worked actually with a family with young children, and it was a parent who actually had a brain tumor, and she had a poor prognosis. And we did some family work with them. And in that work, instead of kind of closing up and not wanting to really have a discussion about the diagnosis and what it meant for the family, with the support of actually 2 therapists and the family, they came together and they were able to actually talk about what this meant for mom to have a diagnosis with the children at their level. And before the mother died, they really talked about what it was going to mean when mom died. And the children wanted to do something for their mom and for their family. And they were able to create this wonderful art installation from different words that the children chose about their mom. And they actually found someone who painted this beautiful picture for them and donated it to the family. And they shared that to mom at bedside before she died, and they were able to just really have this connection. So in that suffering and in that moment, they actually as a family came together, and the family since then has even talked about the value of that, being able to come so close in such a trying time. So and there's elements too of just even for somebody who might be at a beginning stage cancer or healing and then survivorship, turning that idea around of feeling like, okay, so I no longer have cancer. Everybody thinks, all right, you should be back to normal while you're still thinking about it. And for them, that's not the experience. And so being able to come through this and really identify what's meaningful to them and what's valuable to them and how they want to move forward, how their life may have changed and what they welcome in as that change has helped people that I've worked with really move through those stages, because they're kind of seeing how they can not just see what was hard, what people aren't understanding, but what they wanted to identify as meaningful and valuable to them as they lived forward.
And then another question. We have some staff from the Pediatric Brain Tumor Foundation present on the town hall, as well as some hospital staff. What advice do you have for those staff? How can staff, whether they're in a nonprofit or a hospital setting, help families through the process of finding meaning in suffering and uncertainty?
It's a good question. I think being present. I mean, really, I don't think that you have to come with a toolkit so much, although there's wonderful ways to open up conversations that are very guided. But being present with the family and allowing for some of the more difficult discussions, I would say, would be key to just start that. You're being able to build a relationship with the family and having them kind of be able to express themselves and what they're afraid of, or what their fears are, what their hopes are. And that first, that just that space that you can hold that for somebody, hold that with somebody, and have them express what goals are. I think that in and of itself is that relationship piece. If we talked about those sources of meaning, you as a healthcare provider, I think, can be a part of that development of meaning in that sense. So and even just the idea, there's also tools I shared a little bit, but being able to talk about what's meaningful in the care of a child, what's meaningful in the outcome, what's hopeful, what's, are there hobbies that you want to make sure that your child can do? Are there ways to, if things are out of control, like maybe there's a hospital stay and something else is going on, how can we work around that to bring something that's meaningful to a child in a different way?
That's great. Thank you so much, Shannon. I'll ask you to keep your microphone open and be part of our panel. And as I introduce our two parents, I'll go ahead and ask them to unmute their microphones. And please continue to type any thoughts, questions into the chat box that you might have for either one of our parents or for Dr. Cava. So first, I'd like to introduce Chris Wex, who is the owner of Abound Services, an organization that assists individuals with developmental disabilities and their families. Chris's background in advocacy is inspired by his 9-year-old daughter, Scarlett, who had a brain tumor as an infant and suffers global developmental delays to this day. Personally, Chris copes with the challenges of stressful moments through mindful meditation and, when available, reading, cooking, gardening, walking, and creative problem solving. And it occurred to me that I need to advance the slide so that you can see our lovely faces. Kristin Young is a Bible teacher, writer, and fine arts photographer. She and her husband, Bryant, have 6 children, one of whom is in heaven after a 2-year fight with brain cancer. Kristin feels a firm calling to encourage others to look for hope while in the valley. Kristin holds a master's in social welfare from the University of California, Berkeley, and is currently pursuing a master's in divinity from Fuller Seminary. Additionally, she serves on the National Board of Directors for the Pediatric Brain Tumor Foundation. And Chris, I think I'll start with a question we've had for you. Have you found meaning from what your family has gone through? And if you did, what is that meaning and how did you find it?
Thank you for that question. I think that I find meaning from everything that we've dealt with my daughter, particularly, and her brain tumor journey. I think we find meaning from it occasionally. I think from time to time, I realize that that my wife and I were the right sort of people in the right place to deal with everything that Scarlett needed. And I find meaning when when I talk to other people who are going through similar situations, or when I'm able to help people who are going through other challenges related to their child's health or their own health. And so sometimes I find it meaningful, and then honestly, sometimes I don't. I think that it's fair to say that the pain and the loss and the grief that I feel from everything that our family's gone through it sometimes leaves me without a sense of meaning, and I'm left with just the pain and the suffering part of it. And so So I mentioned in my little bio there the meditation piece, and so sometimes for me, all I can do is deal with the pain part without having yet found anything meaningful to derive from it. So I think I think it's important to remember that we're not all going to always have that meaningful moment clear and centered in our frame, and sometimes we'll lose it and we'll get it back hopefully. And so that meditation piece is a big part of how I deal with pain when I don't have meaning. So I just want to say that other side of this as well.
Yeah, that's an important aspect to this journey as well. Thank you for sharing that, Chris. And then Kristen, welcome. I will ask the same question of you as our other parent panelists with different experience. How have you found meaning through what your family went through? And if you did, what is that meaning and how did you find it?
Okay, well, just like life, especially life in the Cancer Valley, my gardener is blowing leaves, so I hope you guys don't hear too much noise in the background. He's walking away. But I think, for us, I was thinking about this question. I think in order for us to find the meaning, to have found the meaning, still be searching for the meaning, like Chris said, is that we had to acknowledge that this sucks. That there's no way. I keep trying to find a fancy SAT word for suck, but I haven't. So I continue to say that being in the Cancer Valley, sometimes the hards of life, they just suck, and that's a part of life. And for us, so for me personally, it goes back to my faith, what I believe my holy scriptures say. It challenged me when Colby was, our son's name was Colby, he passed away. When Colby was diagnosed, it challenged me, what do I really believe? Am I living out what my Bible professes? And if not, why not? And being in the Cancer Valley with a child was the perfect fertile ground for me to hash some things out with God about what he told me my Bible would say, and that is that there's going to be some joy and there's going to be some pain in this life. Pre-cancer, I didn't really fully believe him about the pain part. Post-cancer, I fully believe that. So for me, the meaning isn't so much why is there pain. The meaning for me is on the other side of pain in heaven, God has an answer. And that's what gets me out of bed in the morning. That's what allows me to see that even though it sucks and the grief pain hurts of having my son in heaven and me here on earth, that ultimately my faith tells me that God has a solution for it. And then the other big piece of that is Colby was the oldest of, he was the second oldest of 6 kids for us. And he passed away when he was 15. And when I look back on everything that he accomplished in the 2 years that he was diagnosed in the Valley, he did more in 2 years as far as bringing people together, as far as bringing our family together, as far as bringing his school community together. He did more in 2 years than I firmly believe that he would have done in 100 years of living on this earth. So his purpose was fully lived out in his life. And in that, I find that it's not so much the length of life that we have, but the depth of life that we have.
Yeah, that's a beautiful statement. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to just circle back to Dr. Cava and put you on the spot to, just speak again from your experience, from your viewpoint as a professional, now that we've heard from the two parents.
Well, I want to thank Chris and Kristen because those were beautiful sentiments, and Chris making the point too that sometimes we're not thinking about meaning. Sometimes there's pain, and that's okay. Really giving that awareness that we're not striving for a perfect. This is just an element of how we can bring some different elements of meaning and purpose to our life and to our family. For me, and working maybe in the last group that I did with the meaning-centered psychotherapy, And this work historically at our site has been with adults with cancer, seeing kind of changes and seeing over the course of 8 weeks, someone who didn't really have a way of looking at any positives in their life, to a way to kind of start dipping their toe into other elements of their life outside of cancer that brought them some, I think that deeper, Kristen said, that depth of life, that they recognized depths in areas that they didn't see before. So this is a tool that can be used and can be, we can walk away from it and then we can dip back into it. So I would say, I think absolutely the understanding that we're not striving to be perfect. And again, when we introduce the idea of happiness, happiness doesn't mean that we cannot have sadness, we can't have anger, we can't have, other feelings of distress. But how can we find a tool to help us manage some of those uncomfortable emotions, but acknowledging that it's okay to have them as well.
Thank you for that. Another question, and Chris, I'm going to toss it back to you again. Have you found that your values changed because of your brain tumor journey, and how have they changed?
I almost can't remember who I was before my daughter was diagnosed, to be honest with you. I think they did. I think my values have changed. I think the person that I am now is a lot more focused on what's going on in front of me and around me, and I'm much more concerned with people and their circumstances than maybe I was. It's a tough question. I truly, and my wife and I go back and forth on this. There's a real fog about what happened, where my mental state was, what I thought about, what I cared about before Scarlett was diagnosed. What I can say is that it was probably a profound change to what I value, and I can tell you that what I value now very much is inspired by the journey that we've taken. So when I talk to people, and I talk to a lot of people with who are going through medical trauma or are challenged by the system and getting insurance or getting appropriate services to meet their needs, I'm driven to help because I remember what it's like to sort of go through the tangle that we did in that process. So I've got to say that must be a change from what I previously was. So I absolutely think the events of our lives change us and change our values, and that would definitely be true of that. During this COVID crisis with our shutdown and everything, I'm not sure. I think that what I value now has remained the same in light of all of that. But I have had to strike the right kind of balance between competing values. I can't be back here in the back bedroom in a Zoom call and actively schooling my daughter. I have to make choices about what it is I'm doing. And between my wife and I, we figure that out. But I think this particular crisis has allowed me to sort of attune my values and make choices about what it is I need to do during certain times.
Thank you, Chris. Kristen, I have an additional question for you. What meaning have you seen that your children find in this valley of suffering? We can talk about patients and siblings, and Chris, I might even toss it back to you about that as well. But Kristen, could you address that question?
Oh, absolutely. I remember when Colby was first diagnosed. Our youngest was 2 at the time, and Colby was 13, and our oldest was 15. So we had toddlers and one that was getting ready to figure out what life was going to be like and graduate and go to college, and walking her through that, all while walking Colby through the Cancer Valley and then walking him to Jesus. So I've thought a lot about how this has affected my kids, looking at them, and their personalities are so different. Colby was in high school with our oldest one, so his relationship was pretty close to hers. So for her, when he passed away, it must have been maybe 2 or 3 weeks after he passed away, she came into our bedroom and she's like, Mom, I realized that in my lifetime, I'm probably going to feel like this several more times. Saying that I'm probably going to feel loss. I'm probably going to feel grief. I'm probably going to feel sadness and things that are beyond my control. And so our conversation that ensued was one of more, yeah, you're right, because this is life. So let's talk about how do you maneuver this now? So when you feel like this again, you have those tools to know what to do with it. And I think as a college student, she's about to graduate in December from college, her college experience was much more rich. She pursued friends that had a depth of character rather than just a party attitude, just because she knows that life is short. I have another child who is getting ready to start the college application process, and her whole decision, I think, to go into the medical field. She found meaning in seeing her brother fight and knowing what it was like to be in hospitals that don't feel quite like home. And now she wants to go in the medical profession and work with kids. So my younger two they were 3 and 5 when Colby passed away. But I still see a depth of empathy, even when they can look at me now and be like, Mom, are you thinking about Colby? Or Mom, do you need a hug? So the things that they have gotten out of it aren't things that I can necessarily say this is why they're like this because they had a brother like this. There may have been those character traits or personality traits in them anyway. But the way that we talk about Colby's life, the way we celebrate who Colby was, the way we still talk about him at the dinner table, all help them know, I think, that you can be extremely sad, like what Shannon was saying and Chris was saying. You can be extremely sad and extremely joyful all in the same moment, and it's beautiful when you're able to mix them together. And that's a lot of what life is about, that there's going to be some valleys and there's going to be some hills, but finding meaning on both is, as I think, where my kids have been so even in their walk and in their growth, is that they don't get too high and they don't get too low. So.
Chris, do you want to respond to that as well?
Yeah, so the question was about how our children have found meaning in suffering. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, this is a challenging one. Scarlett is our oldest child, and she finished treatment, and now we have 3 children. We have adopted 2 other children since Scarlett, and so our 2 other children, I have a 4-year-old boy, or a 5-year-old boy, gosh, who his name is Benny, and he didn't have to deal with treatment or anything related to that, but my daughter has a lot of behavioral issues related to the her treatment and her tumor and everything. She has cognitive delays, and she has tantrums like a small child. She doesn't really have an appropriate sense of touch. So she's often pinching or trying to pick up my toddler, and she's not very safe carrying her around. these are really challenging things that, in particular, at least at this time, my son has to try and wrap his head around. And so I've watched him, and I've tried to deal with and manage and find meaning in the in sort of the after effects of Scarlett's treatment. And it's a real challenge, but I see how he manages the situation. He's learning how to, honestly be protective of himself, but also wanting to interact with his older sister. And I'm trying to teach him that, sometimes people go through challenges, or they're different, and that the way that we interact with them is going to be differently, but that he himself can find his own choice. He doesn't need to do that. He can make his own choices. He can be responsible and respectful, but also affectionate and caring. We're kind of swirling around trying to find meaning with all of this. I don't have a lot of firm answers to that question. My older daughter Scarlett, my older daughter Scarlett, she's dealing with these after effects, and I'm trying to find ways to show her how to be, and it involves a lot of different kinds of therapies. She's in behavioral therapy, but also the way that I approach walking her through her own challenges involves clarifying and simplifying what it is that's painful about her in a given moment, which is sometimes a challenge, and learning how to address that through things like breath work and calming down. So yeah, I mean, I think that and my youngest daughter is still a toddler, so we're not quite there yet, but I think all of my kids are finding meaningful ways to cope with what's happening around them. And I think a lot of children do that, no matter what they're dealing with. And so we're working on that, and I think our kids are too.
Thank you, Chris. Shannon, I'll toss it back to you from a professional perspective, and maybe a little twist on the sort of the very same question and same thought is how, from the professional side of things, how do you teach children to find meaning when they're the ones who are suffering? That's kind of a loaded question.
I think in teaching, if we take the stress off of being a teacher of meaning to just those interactions, both Chris and Kristen really discussed how they are engaged with the siblings and with the child that has a cancer diagnosis. And I think that relationship, again, will be a foundation to that meaning, and modeling even how a parent gains or interprets what's happening in their world or what's happening in their surroundings, and modeling that there can be different frames, right? Different perspectives where, wondering in something that's very difficult, what the reaction is in the child, and allowing the child to maybe see different points of view, but modeling it in their own actions, much like both have already kind of described, that it's probably something that you're modeling in terms of a child reacting to a sibling being diagnosed with cancer and potentially dying from cancer, and them changing the values that they have and wanting to change a career path or move into a helping service. So that's all incorporated in that teaching, right? So rather than sit down and say, let's find what's meaningful, but there can be the interventions where it's just really having a child talk about their experience in each moment and letting them work through those experiences. And that, I think, will be a very supportive way for a child to be able to find meaning. Whether it be, I want to express my anger or my confusion, and allowing space for that, and then developing through time of how maybe they are going to see what that means to them, and how they might want to react, what the reaction and forward movement would be from that.
Thank you. I have another question for our parents, and Kristen, I'll I'll turn to you. How do you think about your family's future, and how has that changed as a result of what you've suffered?
Ooh, that's a good question. It's a hard question, right? It's my husband and I got married. We said we wanted 4 children. We were blessed with 6. And now it feels like one of my sheep is out of the pen. And although I love the 5 that are in there, I know for the rest of my life, and I've made peace with the fact for the rest of my life, that it will always feel like there's one out of the pen. But the flip side to that is that my belief, my faith, I know where he is. He's not lost. So I walk in that every day, that he is one less soul that I have to worry about and shepherd, because he's with someone who loves him more, immeasurably more than I can. So that's my first thought about when I think about my family, that my kids don't belong to me. Having a child in college, I definitely see. My kids do not belong to me. There's only a short season and then they're off, and they're living their best life, they think. So so it has firmly made my husband and I, in fact, we just made the decision this weekend to pull our younger 2 and homeschool them. We homeschooled for a while before Colby got sick. But now, after Colby passing away, we realized that that period is so finite to pour into their lives. So we pull them to homeschool them for the next 2 or 3 years, just to pour into them before we send them back out. And for us, when we think about family, we know that this time is not infinite. We have a finite number of years, days, hours to pour into them. And so we want to do as much as we can, given the situation that we're in. So there have been times when our oldest one came home from college because of COVID. And those are the times when we're all sitting around the dinner table where it's blaringly obvious that there's a seat that's empty. Those are the times that probably hurt the most as far as my family, like looking at my kids. But there is also a joy that we still keep Colby's memory alive, and he's not a hush word. So he is as much a part of our family now as he was when he was here physically. So I try and keep that in perspective, that I'm just stewards over my kid's life. Having a child who is medically fragile, that means being an advocate for them. The best way I know how, that means making decisions for them with the information that I have in front of me right now, and not trying to live in the what ifs or I should haves, but knowing that we made the best decisions with the information that was given, being their advocate. And it also just means knowing that this parenting gig is hard. It's not what we signed up for. It's not what we thought it was going to be. Had God showed me 19 years ago how Colby's life would end, I would absolutely sign up for the same thing. So it's you hold both in your hand, and you say, okay, this is what it is.
Thank you, Kristen. Chris, I'll turn to you now. How do you think about your family's future, and how has that changed as a result of how your family has suffered?
How do I think about our family's future? I think we have a bright future. I think about it differently. I think I have more long-term planning in my noggin than I previously used to have, because I have to think through I have to think through decisions on behalf of Scarlett that I wouldn't necessarily have considered my responsibility previously, which isn't to say that I'm not going to help guide all my kids to their most successful, happiest selves, but you begin to think about what kind of house is going to suit a family where one of my children may live with us for a very long time. And you begin to think about, you know, you begin to make financial plans that are different than maybe the sort of aggressively spend down the bank account this month model that I had when I was younger. And maybe that's just getting older. Maybe that's just growing up, and has nothing to do with Scarlett's diagnosis. But it's definitely a part of our thinking now. I plan for a lot. I spend time thinking about how to create interactions between my children that will foster long-term loving relationships between them. And I'm not sure that I ever strategized for that sort of thing in previous versions of myself. I think through, I choose to, I could probably, you know, with this new business I've started, I'm up, you know, 2 a.m. sometimes working, but sometimes I stop working, and I get sleep because it makes me physically healthier, because I'm beginning to think about my long-term health and well-being and how that relates to how I'm going to be able to take care of my children longer. So I don't know, that's long-term thinking, I guess, has been a part of what's been built into everything we've been through. I don't know that that besides the logistics of like maybe we get a maybe we look for a house with a second master bedroom suite. I'm not sure that our values have changed too much, but we do think very long term now. We do that's a big part of what we do when we're dealing with day-to-day stuff. So there's something.
Thank you, Chris. We are nearing the end of the hour. We've got about 2 minutes, and we've just had another question. And Kristen, I'll go ahead and ask you this. How has your experience with cancer prepared you for COVID?
Ooh. I love the COVID bubble. I think I'm probably the only person in our neighborhood who has said this, because like I said before, Colby was sick for 2 years, and it was 2 years of where our life was on hold pretty much. He we live in Charlotte, so he did proton therapy in Boston, and then he did chemotherapy in Raleigh. So we were up in Raleigh back and forth, and then he ended up doing a clinical trial in Florida. So for 2 years, Bryant and I would tag team, and he would be with the kids, and I would be with Colby for a week wherever he was getting treatment, and then Bryant would fly out, and then I would fly back home to be with the kids. But in that whole time, we felt like we were in a little bubble, and we had an excuse to be in a bubble and not interact with the rest of the world. And then once Colby passed away, and we're almost 4 years out of him being healed in heaven, and life kind of picks up again, and things happen, and things you thought that would never, I'm never going to be this way. And, all those things you said that would never happen, all of a sudden you find yourself falling back into those old patterns. So COVID for us has just been, I've loved having my college student home. She went away and she came back, and so prepared me. Okay, she's going to go away again. I hate that one person has died from COVID. That is the sympathy and empathy that comes with having a child deal with a life-altering or life-threatening illness, is that one death is one death too many, especially when you walk through the grief of it. So I hold both of those very loosely, being grateful to have this time and have an excuse to just hang out with my kids and plan nothing. But I also hate that people are mourning and grieving and burying their loved ones under the limitations of COVID.
Thank you. We are going to have that be our final question and thought. And thank you so much, Kristen. As our time concludes, I want to thank our speaker, Dr. Shannon Cava. I want to thank Chris Wex and Kristin Young for your time, for sharing your expertise, for digging deep and sharing your experiences with us. It's helped a great deal, so thank you. And I also want to thank you, our attendees, for your participation, thoughtful questions. Please reach out to us at the PBTF for support at the contact information that you'll see on this slide. I want to thank my colleague, Heather Held, who was a big part of making this happen. You'll be hearing from her. We'll be sending you a link to the recording of the town hall, and we'll also send you the slides at the email address you registered with. Please stay in touch with us, and we look forward to future events like this. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.